In the last section, we got this loading spinner in, but as we discussed at the very end of the video, showing the text loading is kind of unclear. So in this video, I want to make sure that we can customize that text right there. And we've kind of already gone through this process of customizing a component. Remember, anytime that we want to customize how a component looks or behaves, we're going to pass some props into it. But in this case, there's going to be just a little bit of a twist. Let's first begin by receiving the props object right here inside of spinner. And then rather than having the hard-coded text of loading right there, I'm going to try to reference something like, let's say, props.message. So now the expectation is that anytime that we make use of this spinner component, we should pass in a prop called message. And that's what will be shown right underneath the little animated spinner. So now we can go back over to the index.js file, find where we use the spinner, and then put a new prop in here of message. And I'll give it a value of something like accept, how about please? We'll ask nicely, please accept location request. Something like that. Okay, so now if we flip back over, we'll see please accept the location request. And now it's a lot more clear to the user that I have to respond to this thing right here before the application is going to actually do something. Now what we have right now definitely works. It's just fine. However, I want to point out something interesting. Remember, we put together the spinner as a separate component so that we could reuse it in the future if we wanted to. Just about every project in the world needs a spinner component, and that's why we created it as a separate thing. Now, I want to show you what would happen if we use the spinner component in some other context with forgetting to put that message prop in. So I'm going to highlight the message prop, and I'm just going to cut it out for a second. So if I forget to put that thing in, we now just get the spinner by itself, which is pretty predictable. Rather than showing props.message inside of that div, we no longer have a message, and so nothing appears there. But I would say that's not the best thing in the world. It's entirely possible that you and I might forget to put a message property inside the spinner. And if we do, I don't want to show nothing here. I want to show something, at least some default text like we had before of loading. So there's two ways that we could accomplish this, two ways that we could get some default text in here. I could either turn this into a little OR expression by putting in an OR statement and then putting in some default text like loading, like so. That's one way I could do this. But, and if I flip back over, it definitely works, but there's definitely a better way to approach this. Let me show you the better way. If I want to, after I define my component, I can define something on the function itself called default props. This is going to be an object. And as you might guess, this is going to provide some default properties to this component. So essentially, if we forget or we decide to not put in a message when we create an instance of the spinner, we will instead use the default prop listed down here inside this object. Now, like I said, this is basically the same thing as doing something like this, but it's definitely a little bit more elegant. If we were making reference to props.message several times in this component, we would have to put these OR statements all over the place. And so in general, if we want to have some default or alternate value for our prop, we like to use this default props thing. So to use it, I'm going to list the name of the prop and then the default value for it, which for us will be loading, like so. So this now means that if we make an instance of the spinner component and we do not pass in a message prop, if we don't pass in a message prop, it will be provided a default of loading ... So now we can flip back over and we'll see that it's back to the original loading, even though we did not actually specify a message. Now, of course, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, we do want to customize the message here. So I can paste back in the message of please accept location request. Now that we are providing a prop of message to that component, we are not going to override the default. Or excuse me, yeah, we are going to override the default. I apologize there. We are going to override the default. So no longer are we going to use message. We have provided the prop message here. So if we save this, we'll see that it turns back into please accept location request. Okay, so that's it. In general, it's really nice to use default props like this anytime that we are making very reusable components, because it's going to make sure that you can just create an instance of spinner and get some good result without having to look up exactly how to customize this thing. All right, so let's take another quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, there's one last little thing that we're going to touch on very quickly.